millions of tons of food and textile waste are generated in the European Union. But the mantra of reduce, reuse and recycle to promote the circular economy, like we see in this centre, does not seem enough to drive real change. There was a recent agreement to revise the Waste Framework Directive, but critics say that is not ambitious enough. The fight against waste is at the heart of this week's EU Decoded.
Around 60 million tons of food waste are generated in the EU every year, causing economic losses of €132 billion. Annually, the bloc also generates almost 13 million tons of textile waste, of which 5.2 million tons are clothing and footwear, equivalent to 12 kilograms per person. The European Council and the European Parliament have just reached a provisional agreement on the Waste Framework Directive, setting new reduction targets to be met by 2030.
The new legally binding targets will oblige governments to better promote the circular economy to retail and industry. Let's hear what people have to say about more sustainable production and consumption.
Food that is often discarded could be made cheaper, so people would buy it, eat it, instead of just throwing it away. As a society, I think it's a shame that we waste so much.
For textile, I think that we have to change our lifestyle about it, and we have to buy less textile but better quality.
Oui, mais il y a beaucoup de nourriture qui sont données à des associations. Je ne pense pas qu'il y a vraiment de la nourriture qui est jetée.
Da sind wir halt eine Gesellschaft geworden, eine schnelle Wegwerfgesellschaft. Das wird alles nicht repariert, wenn was kaputt ist, sondern es wird halt gleich ersetzt und neu gekauft und nicht nochmal verwertet.
Ich glaube, man muss wirklich mehr Aufklärung, wie gesagt, auf der einen Seite und politische Einflussnahme auf der anderen Seite zusammenbringen.
With us is Robert Hutchison to explain the target revision of the Waste Framework Directive. In the food sector, what targets do member states need to hit by 2030?
So there are two targets they have to hit by the end of 2030. There's a 30% target for reduction of food waste in retail, supermarkets and so on, in restaurants and catering, and households. There's a separate target of 10% which applies to the manufacture of foods and the processing of foods, so before it reaches supermarket shelves.
On the other side, about 11% of food waste occurs in the farmers' sector, but there is no specific target for farmers. And this was criticized by the European Consumer Organization. Why were they exempted from this?
One of the problems is that farming's become a very hot political potato in recent months. The European Parliament originally wanted to have a review by the end of this year with a possible target for what they call primary production, which is farming, to be put in place. In the end, when the negotiations were finished, we're left with a review clause, which means by the end of 27, they'll review the way the whole system is working and then decide if there is any scope to extend it to the farming sector.
And in the textile sector, there are no specific targets to be met. Instead, they will be covered for the so-called extended producer responsibility regime. What is this about?
And it basically means that if you want to sell clothes, you have to pay a certain fee as well, which is theoretically then channeled into the collection and sorting and recycling of clothes once they get to the waste stage after use. So individual countries will have leeway to increase those fees in the case of fast fashion based on ideas about how clothes are marketed and how long they're intended to be worn. And if they meet certain requirements, then they can increase the fees for, companies that produce what are sometimes regarded as disposable clothes or throwaway clothes.
Some member states are performing better at reducing waste. Some of the best mechanisms for donating food that is still safe to eat can be found in Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Portugal. There's also a proposal for textiles to be classed alongside plastics and electronics in an international treaty, aimed at preventing transfer of hazardous waste to less developed countries. This is supported by Austria, Denmark, Finland, France and Sweden.
With us is Green Danish lawmaker Rasmus Nordqvist, shadow rapporteur on this directive. How confident are you that these new targets for food waste are going to make a real change when they seem to be less ambitious than what the UN and activists are demanding?
I mean, you can always go in and say, yes, we could have done more, but I think with these targets, we're going to see concrete action in the member states. And food waste is a huge problem when you look globally at the need for food. Everybody can see it makes no sense to throw out good food. We need to keep it, we need to eat it, and we need to make this transition.
But a lot of food that is still good for consumption, like you say, ends up in the trash bin, especially in the so-called high-end environments like casinos, hotels, cruises. Should these be more monitored?
It should be monitored in a way that this demands a change of how people are working with food. How do we use all the ingredients? How do we also not make up too much for these oversized buffets that nobody is eating? So when I talk to chefs and when I talk to restaurants, they're actually very keen to do this because also nobody likes to throw out good food.
Now let's talk about textiles. Will these new rules make a real change, considering that a lot of the fast and cheap fashion is coming from outside the EU via the online platforms, namely from China?
There is a big problem with the ultra-fast fashion coming from China. But let's remember as well, fast fashion is not a new thing. We have big European corporations working within the fast fashion industry, and they have to change as well. So with the new producer responsibility, we are actually demanding of them to take responsibility all the way through the value chain.
And finally, the EU is somehow also part of this illegal textile waste export circuit to less developed countries. Do you think that the directive will curb this somehow?
It's important for me to say we're not going to change the whole industry just with this directive, but it's an important step because we need to, first of all, look at how are we consuming textiles, but also what do we do with them after. And we need circularity. That's the next step, is also to make demands on how much circular economy is within fashion industry, but that's one of the next steps.
Foods and textiles are two European industries that need to adapt the most to the Green Deal. But it's not just about the production methods to reduce natural resources and polluting gas emissions. Developing new approaches to the waste culture, like we see here in this neighborhood compost, is a big part of the challenge.